Welcome to this episode of the Common Sense Skeptic, where we're going to dissect the available information from Starship's Pi Day launch of 2024, referred to by most news outlets as IFT3 or OFT3. Apparently, March 14th, 2024, marked SpaceX's 22nd anniversary from the date they were founded. It also marked the third FAA mishap investigation in under a year for the same launch system. While muskrats were, predictably, cheering IFT3 on as a success, as they do every time Musk destroys billions of dollars worth of rocket components, they obviously missed some key details from the day's events, some of which we picked up on during the launch, others we had to go back and check the film carefully to confirm what we thought we saw. And in the end, we'll find out which of our survey's participants called it correctly, between the four options we gave them on this Twitter poll, none of which involved a successfully completed mission, for obvious reasons. But in the spirit of keeping this episode as neutral as possible, let's compare the launch to the declared parameters of a successful mission by referring to this infographic produced by Tony Bella. Tony does a great job of taking all available information on these launches, then condensing them down into a one-pager. For this launch, he was even kind enough to provide both a text-heavy detailed version and this uncluttered graphics-only frame. Going through this masterwork, we can see that IFT3 was meant to launch, then separate using the hot stage maneuver, after which the Super Heavy booster number 10 was to do a hover and soft landing in the Gulf of Mexico, while the Starship continued on to suborbit for a couple of tech demonstrations before splashing down in a controlled manner into the Indian Ocean. We had previously mentioned the need for this machine to control its hover, to prove controlled descent, especially when coming into the tower for the chopsticks to catch it, and it would appear that SpaceX did in fact intend to test that ability on this launch. The on-flight demonstrations on board Starship were to include the opening of the payload bay door, or what they call the PEZ dispenser, and an in-craft propellant transfer. That was the declared mission plan. So we're going to compare that plan against reality and the NASA contract expectations from when NASA awarded SpaceX the sole HLS contract 3 years ago in 2021, when Cathy leaders decided to give this aerospace dumpster fire almost $3 billion taxpayer dollars to play with. Let's see how it went. The IFT3 launch left the launch pad at 9:25 a.m. local time, with some debris flying about in the flames. The NASA Spaceflight Remote Cam got some better footage of that event from their vantage point, with their shot catching the shockwaves being emitted, the debris being flung about, and the dust plume that would cover the entire area. The vehicle cleared the tower in short order, with all 33 Raptor engines on Super Heavy Booster 10 firing, some of them perhaps not as clean as others if the telltale exhaust is any indicator. As we've said before, the exhaust on a methane Raptor should be clean, and any discoloration indicates a less than ideal chamber mix between the propellants. But all 33 engines remain lit, and the only thing falling away from the craft as it climbed seemed to be chunks of ice and a couple of thermal protection tiles. For IFT3, both the Super Heavy booster and Starship were equipped with multiple exterior cameras to relay video during the ascent, and they sent back far better real-time images than IFT2. Going back to IFT1, we were unconvinced that the max-Q callout for that launch was accurate, since they did not seem to be high enough or fast enough for that callout. The suspicion being that it was a timed event rather than based on actual readings. IFT1 was at only 8 km altitude, moving 838 km an hour. IFT2 was at 10 km, moving 1,269 km per hour. Let's see where IFT3 got called out.
At this point, we've already passed through max Q, that maximum dynamic pressure.
So yes, 1,260 km per hour, just crossing 11 km altitude. That's going to confirm the fake callout from IFT1, as Raptors were dying like flies on that ship on its way to its ultimate demise. Booster hot stage separation occurred on schedule without incident. All but 3 of the 33 Super Heavy booster Raptors shut down. The 6 Raptors on Starship fired up, and the 2 vehicles split apart at T+248. By this time, Super Heavy propellant tanks are largely but unevenly depleted, sitting at 9.1% on the LOX tank and 10.7% on the methane. Call it a 17% disparity between the two. Super Heavy peels away to conduct a hover and soft landing in the Gulf of Mexico. The booster's inner rings of 13 Raptor engines reignite in a staggered, symmetric pattern and burn until 3:38, when they shut down in a completely different pattern, shutting down from right to left in the graphic, with the center cluster all shutting down together. This is just after the ship has performed a counterclockwise roll. At this time, both propellant gauges on the booster are barely registering. Given that the other startup and shutdown patterns on the Raptors have been symmetrical, it is possible that the shutdown pattern we saw was the result of low levels of propellant in the vehicle. After the Raptors shut down, venting gas escapes the aft end of the vehicle, which turns into a more energetic event at T+405. If this was the methane venting mentioned at step 3C, it doesn't appear to have an immediate effect. But shortly afterwards, the stern begins to drop and the velocity begins to pick up again after bottoming out at 308 kilometers per hour. At T+438, commentator Kate informs the viewers what is supposed to happen next.
The boost back burn was the first of 2 burns required to return it to Earth. The next one will be the landing burn, where all 13 center engines will initially ignite and then transition into a 3-engine burn to help slow it down.
So we're looking for those same 13 Raptor engines to reignite, then drop back down to 3 for a soft splashdown. Now remember what we said since the very first Starship launch of various items to watch out for to indicate a potential failure. One of them is venting, which we have been seeing on this ship for 2 minutes, and another is green flame. The glide fins of Super Heavy begin swinging around at the 6-minute mark, the free-falling vehicle hitting a top speed of 4,340 km per hour at an altitude of 25 km at T+625, descending through thin layers of cloud. At T+646, the fins on Super Heavy attempt to straighten the vehicle out as it begins to lean over to the right in the orientation diagram. At T+654, at 1 kilometer altitude, 1 Raptor engine in the center trio and 2 random ones in the middle ring of 10 try to ignite. The flames coming up the side are distinctly orange, and then at 657, the orange flames turn green, which, as we know from previous launches, is one or more of the Raptors cannibalizing their own copper components. 2 seconds later, the booster slams into the Gulf of Mexico at an as-yet undeclared location. The readout's frozen, with a speed showing 1,111 km per hour, 1 Raptor alight, and the craft itself listing over to the left at about 11 degrees. To give you an idea how fast it was going on impact, this is a military jet going roughly the same speed. Chances are excellent that this vehicle was shredded on impact. So why did it fail to hover and land as outlined in the mission plan? We're going to chalk it up as a combination between Raptor reliability on relight and running out of propellant. The 3 Raptors that did relight chewed themselves up with the propellant gauges barely registering levels in their tanks, which leads to another question. If this booster was fully loaded, as it appeared to be, and the machine burned through too much propellant to land safely in a splashdown scenario, how are they going to adjust those parameters to accommodate a fully outfitted and loaded Starship or HLS variant, and also make it back to the landing pad, then hover until the chopsticks can grab hold of the booster safely? This Starship test article was completely empty, and the booster ran out of gas. Of course, as tends to happen after we produced that segment, SpaceX reported a different outcome had taken place with Booster 10. On the SpaceX website now, they make the following claim regarding the end of flight. They claim Super Heavy successfully lit several engines for its first ever landing burn. Sure, 3 Raptors kinda lit up, but they didn't stay lit. Their flame was green and the tanks were empty. Before the vehicle experienced a RUD, that's SpaceX speak for Rapid Unscheduled Disassembly. Well, 60 Minutes had a slightly different way of putting that.
Rapid Unscheduled Disassembly is SpaceX speak for our Starship rocket just blew up, again.
The booster's flight concluded at approximately 462 meters in altitude and under 7 minutes into the mission. That would be about here. So what we thought were flames bouncing off the water of the Gulf of Mexico in the final frames of the booster landing, smashing into the Gulf of Mexico in one piece, was actually Booster 10 exploding from the bottom up, half a kilometer in the air, moving at that speed. Therefore, even a worse outcome than what we had gathered from the footage. Booster 10 didn't even remain intact before hitting the water. With the wreckage of Booster 10 sinking to the bottom of the Gulf, we'll head back to Starship 28 to see how this empty test article is making out on Step 4, as it burns 3 sea level and 3 vacuum optimized Raptors trying to attain orbital velocity. When the feed picks up Starship again, it's moving 17,800 kilometers per hour, about 2/3 of orbital velocity, at an altitude of 144 kilometers and climbing. The horizontal orientation of the craft steady, with the port side fin facing Earth. This high-definition view of Earth is idyllic, and looking down the length of Starship, there only appears to be a couple of thermal protection tiles, on this side anyway, that have been lost. Around the T+8 minute mark, SIVA is already beginning to spin Booster 10, that just smashed into the ocean at Mach 1.
We demonstrated controlled entry of the booster. Just stopped a little short of the engine relay, but hey, that's something we can learn for the next one.
Yeah.
Basically, fingers crossed for better luck next time, or the time after that. As video signals become intermittent, at T+821, the 3 vacuum-optimized Raptors shut down, vehicle now moving at 25,665 kilometers per hour. The 3 sea-level Raptors in the center shut down at 8:35, and immediately afterwards an energetic event happens in the aft of this vehicle as well, after which gases vent from the back end of this vehicle that were not present before. This event is strong enough to dislodge some black materials that fall off towards Earth, and marks the fastest that the craft will register at 26,486 kilometers per hour, elevation 150 kilometers, but continuing to climb as speed bleeds away gradually. The propellant tank readings for this vehicle are both already negligible at this point. Backing up a bit to around the 840 mark, commentator Kate adds some confusion to the mix, parroting a call-out regarding Starship.
As you heard there by the call-out and from the crowd behind us, Starship's 6 Raptor engines have successfully shut down. We heard a call-out for nominal orbital insertion, which is incredible. Look at these views, Dan.
Of course, for a nominal orbital insertion, a vehicle has to attain orbital velocity, and Starship 28 is still well short of that. That callout is false. For almost 4 minutes in this stretch, various venting occurs as the vehicle trades speed for altitude, just before the stream is interrupted by a communications blackout. The ship is moving 130 kilometers per hour slower, but has gained 31 kilometers in altitude since the engines shut down. High enough to be considered in LEO in terms of altitude, but not fast enough to insert into orbit, as it is short of the 28,800 kilometers per hour required. The commentators are done for the time being as the vehicle is entering what they call the coast phase, and there's apparently nothing for them to report on, despite there being 2 tech demonstrations to conduct. And at this point, to our surprise, the feed audio switches over to elevator music, making it a little tricky to catch the ground control callouts as they happen. One of the demonstrations aboard IFT3, located at Step 5, with a time marker of 11:56 on the info frame, was opening the payload bay door, referred to by muskrats and ground control as the Pez dispenser. For the international audience tuning in, that's a reference to a popular candy that is released one at a time by tilting back the collectible head at the top of a reloadable candy magazine. Aboard Starship, according to this animation, the system is supposed to release Starlink satellites through the side of the craft to deploy them into orbit. But the only portion of that device aboard IFT3 was the door apparatus. No other portion of that assembly was brought along for the launch. The primary components appear to be 2 hydraulic or similar arms attached to the curved door panel itself, first seen at about 1420 of the flight, located here in this camera angle with visible gases floating around in the payload bay. That door is still obviously sealed shut at 1420. What we didn't realize until we went back through the entire video a couple more times is that the command to open this door actually happened at around the 12-minute mark, 2.5 minutes before this shot.
Views or no views, we'll see you back here at T+40 minutes.
Pez door is opening.
And there we just heard call it that Pez door is opening, so that's great.
First test.
Since the door obviously didn't respond to the 12-minute mark callout, there's another call for a Pez check buried in the music 2 minutes later.
Pez checker.
Without any further audible callout, the payload door is opened at around the T+16 minute mark, but we don't get to see the initial sequence of events due to lack of video signal. By the time signal acquisition for the craft comes back at T+1608, the door is as open as it's going to get, which does not seem to have opened all the way from this angle. Certainly there appears to be a lot of room left on the hydraulic arms for it to open further. The other camera angle probably would have been better, but that one is never used again. We notice a couple of things here. The atmospheric gas in the compartment gets blown out and lit up by strong sunlight coming through this gap in the fuselage. And you'll notice a new rotation in the craft that wasn't there in the last live shot, represented in the light reflections and shadows moving across the interior of the ship. It's possible that the venting of the atmospheric gas inside the ship through the PEZ door could have had an unintended thruster effect on the craft. Sped up to 800%, this movement is even more apparent. We're guessing the intermittent signal acquisition at this time is now due at least in part to the new rotation of the craft. This shot stays with the cargo bay door until the 18-minute mark, when the video feed goes dark for a full minute. When the feed comes back, the ship is rolling around its longitudinal axis before the signal is dropped again. Skipping forward to around T plus 2830, ground control announces that the PEZ checkout is complete and the doors are going to close.
PEZ checkout's complete, doors closing.
Except, does that door look like it's closing to you? A minute and a half later, the door has still not sealed itself. We have another drop in signal, and when it comes back, we see this happen to the door at T plus 3018, which would give the indication that the door had an issue and is now stuck in this open position. If you missed it, here it is again, sped up, to make it more obvious. Video feed on this camera is again interrupted, and at no point later in the broadcast is the PEZ door shown again to confirm the door has been put back in place by the door mechanism. So it would appear the door did not work as expected and was very likely jammed open during the descent phase. Now, just as a reminder, SpaceX does not have a contract to deploy satellites for NASA with Starship in this manner. So any effort being put into this demonstration and technology would likely have been better spent trying to get a proper test article for the HLS demo together in the first place. Which brings us to the propellant demonstration supposedly conducted during this mission, which SpaceX does have a contract for with NASA, but not in the manner conducted. We say supposedly because we've definitely got some questions about this demo, which SpaceX declared was conducted during this flight, moving cryogenic liquid oxygen between two tanks inside this vehicle. The first question we've got is, how does moving propellant between tanks aboard the same craft in any way whatsoever qualify as a proof of benchmark when the required technology for Artemis is moving two unique propellants between different vessels linking up in orbit? Jim Free has mentioned this while participating on several different panels, and the next benchmark required by NASA from SpaceX was stated quite clearly.
SpaceX is on contract to do an uncrewed lander. Our milestone before that is the ship-to-ship cryogenic propellant transfer. We're delaying our CDR until they complete that, and then they have to just get flying.
Ship-to-ship prop transfer in orbit is the next benchmark. That's not what was on the menu for IFT3. But that being said, let's take a closer look at Starship 28 going back to the pad. During the pre-game show, the commentators went through the process of loading propellant for the stacked vehicle as a graphic on the left side of the frame. There are representations of the LOX and CH4 tanks on Super Heavy 10. And for Starship 28, there is the LOX tank, the CH4 tank, and the LOX header tank built right into the nose of the craft, which makes perfect sense given that's where the docking airlock for HLS is supposed to be located. What we're not seeing here is any additional tank loaded up for the propellant demonstration located in the chamber of the Starship, and that would be reflected in any visible venting during the propellant load. Vapors are being vented from various locations along the length of the combined vehicle, but we're not seeing any venting from the payload compartment. And as it turns out, we also have views from inside the craft payload bay thanks to the camera watching the payload door demonstration that failed, where again, no additional tank can be seen. An explanation for that, as it turns out, is very simple. This propellant transfer demonstration has been dummied down to bleeding off liquid oxygen into the main LOX tank. SpaceX's grand accomplishment to claim the remaining money on their HLS contract was the ability to simply transfer propellant from the header tank to the other, mainly empty, main LOX tank on board. That was their entire propellant demonstration, if it happened at all. At T plus 2435, again buried in the elevator music, while the screen shows there is no communication with the ship, a call goes out from ground control that the propellant transfer demonstration is underway.
Starship's flight computer is in propellant transfer demo.
Call out for completion comes less than 2 minutes later at T plus 2613, again buried in the music.
The Starship flight computer is in the propellant transfer complete state.
And the entire time the screen is shown, ground control is awaiting acquisition of signal. During that entire minute and 40 seconds, the ship itself was spinning, as could be seen through the Pez dispenser door. And if you take a look at the levels of both propellant tanks at this point of the flight, they're both at damn near zero, which is not surprising because the machine is continuing to vent gases. But shouldn't that propellant transfer have at least registered on that meter? At some point, we should have been able to watch it climb, at least a little bit, and yet even the sped up gap between events shows no indication of any infusion of LOX into the main tank, meaning we've got reason to doubt that that test was conducted and/or successful. As the social media saying goes, pics or it didn't happen, and conveniently for SpaceX, the Starship is now unavailable for photos. Starting around T plus 3025, there's live feed from the back of the spinning ship as it coasts along at over 26,000 kilometers per hour at around 224 kilometers elevation and dropping. Gas continues to vent and ice breaks away from the hull periodically, as it does here after a gas burst at around the T plus 31 minute mark. After which, the speed of rotation looks to be a little quicker. Measuring the rate of rotation against the horizon of the planet is presently a little over 100 seconds per revolution. Also, if you are watching very carefully at the T plus 3246 mark, what appears to be a meteoroid comes out of nowhere from beyond the back of the ship to run right alongside the ship and pass it. Whatever this was did not detach from the ship, and it ripped right past Starship like it was standing still. One more time in real time. Going back to the infographic now, we pick it up at step 8, where they called for the first ever Raptor relight in space to demonstrate the ability to reliably deorbit Starship. This was supposed to happen just after Starship cleared the east coast of Africa, at T plus 4046 into flight. To clarify, this was not required to deorbit the ship, but would be required for that task in the future. Now going back through video to find the apogee of this flight, the height of the mission arc seems to be at T plus 2530, holding steady at the time at 234 kilometers altitude. From that high point, the craft sheds altitude fairly constantly after hitting that mark. When there is video feed from Starship 28, we can witness the vehicle getting more and more wobbly as vapors continue to shoot out the aft of the vehicle. And when Kate and Siva come back on the broadcast at T plus 38 minutes, this is how they describe the upcoming relight test and remaining mission parameters.
We are coming up on our next major milestones, which is an in-space relight of our Raptor engine for the first time, followed by re-entry and then landing in the Indian Ocean.
Incredible.
And right after they do that explanation, Dan comes on to let everyone know that they're going to skip over this demonstration of technology that was described as being critical for future mission success earlier in this broadcast.
Now, we're also attempting the first ever relight of a Raptor engine in space, and we'll need that capability for future in-space maneuvers and deorbit burns.
This is going to be really important anytime we want to do in-space maneuvers in the future, like eventual deorbit burns, any of our translunar injections that'll have Raptor engines firing back up. It does sound like we are skipping past the on-orbit relight demo this time. So now that's going to start setting us up for re-entry.
Now that demo is off the books, when Kate comes back on, she tells everyone this.
So coming up next around T plus 49 minutes is Starship re-entry. Now, this is typically a portion of flight where we don't have communications with spacecraft because they're re-entering the Earth's atmosphere at or around orbital velocity, about 8 kilometers per second or roughly 5 miles per second.
So T plus 49 is when they were expecting the ship to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. Let's see how close they got. When the live video feed is reestablished, Starship 28 is moving 26,569 kilometers per hour. The altitude has dropped 100 kilometers from its apogee to 134 kilometers altitude, and its back end is hanging almost straight down, pointing towards Earth, while gyrating significantly and spinning. The view from the live feed is quite disorienting, especially when you speed it up. At around T plus 4430, at altitude 118 kilometers, with the African coastline visible under the clouds, something affects the ship that's not immediately obvious, shaking chunks of ice loose from the sides, followed by a flurry of black fragments that bounce along the side of the ship at the 45-minute mark. And from here, the movement of the ship becomes even more erratic as the ship drops a kilometer every 6 seconds, meaning the descent is already running about 600 kilometers per hour towards the ground. At T plus 4613, 3 minutes before Kate's timestamp for re-entry, a pink hue forming on the fin in frame is the first indication that the ship is in contact with the atmosphere and has begun superheating to the point where it is creating the plasma field that now grows. That fin begins to move, and in doing so appears to mitigate the tumbling that the ship has been going through for most of this flight. Digging against the atmosphere causes the fin to get lit up even more brightly and forces the ship to stand up straighter. The camera rotates at T plus 4645 to look right down the length of the ship at the line of thermal protection tiles, with the plasma shooting up both sides of the ship, and this would seem to indicate the ship is facing sideways compared to its direction, therefore not being ideally protected by the thermal protection tiles. The orientation of the ship, indicated by the telemetry bar, is coming down through the atmosphere, standing straight up, confirmed by the view of the ocean below it, courtesy of the camera feed. Shortly afterwards, the plasma field seems to be affecting the engine compartment of the craft, and the attitude of the ship becomes erratic. All the camera can see is the length of the ship as the plasma field engulfs it and intensifies. At T plus 4747, when the ship hits the top speed of 26,759 kilometers per hour, the ship is pretty much doing a nosedive, coming down through the atmosphere face first. On Starship iteration CGIs, that would be where the giant atrium window is located, which would make life very interesting for any tourists aboard. Through a very thick pink haze, the plasma can be seen attacking the back end of the ship until the feed breaks up at about T plus 4830, moving over 26,000 kilometers per hour at 77 kilometers altitude now. After the feed goes dark, the telemetry bar continues to watch the ship flip around and drop until about T plus 4940, when the speed and altitude readings freeze, showing the ship coming down butt first. So this belly flop maneuver has, to this point, not proven to be controllable, given the nosedive the vehicle is in, and at no point did atmospheric braking significantly slow the speed of the craft nor the rate of descent, which was still losing a kilometer in altitude every 6 seconds, as it was before entering the Earth's atmosphere. While the commentators are waiting for something else to comment on, they break out the thermal tile demonstration, failing to mention the entire time that this technology is not proprietary to SpaceX and is in fact licensed for their use from NASA. It's amazing how many people believe that SpaceX invented that technology. After 15 full minutes of back padding and filler and recaps, Dan comes on with this announcement.
And hey, Kate, and hey, Shiva, we were just hearing on the loops, we are making the call now that we have lost Ship 28. So no splashdown today, but again, just it's incredible to see how much further we got this time around. And I know everybody's going to be excited for the next one.
15 minutes after they lost the live video feed, they think they might have probably lost the ship, which, if the 6 seconds per kilometer loss in altitude held true from the time they lost the video feed, the ship had smashed into the ocean about 7 minutes prior. But not to worry, there are many more test flights to come, after the latest FAA mishap report gets rubber stamped. At T plus an hour 5 and change, you can hear some subtle backpedaling here on the demonstrations without them being upfront about the failed results that we assume ground control was aware of.
We also hit a number of our other ambitious test objectives. We had a chance to at least initiate the commands for a propellant transfer demo within the vehicle. This is something that Starship's going to have to do in the future, and these sort of transfers haven't been done at this scale before, so that's a first as well. We also were able to demonstrate that the payload door functions.
And we got to see that, yeah.
Yeah, and so those commands were sent. Again, data review to come and make sure that everything performed as expected. But that's going to be critical to deploying payloads in the future once Starship becomes operational.
Did you hear the walk back in there? They had the opportunity to initiate the commands for the tests, with public disclosure to come after data review. It's been over a week now. Has anybody heard boo about these failures from Musk or SpaceX? No, neither have we. So to summarize what the mainstream media is largely calling a successful launch, let's go through the graphic again from the top. At 1, we watched a successful liftoff of the stacked combined vehicle at 9:25 EDT. At 2, the ship survived max Q at T plus 110 compared to the estimation of T plus 52 seconds. At 3A, hot staging happened at T plus 248, pretty much right in line with Tony's prediction, and so far so good. At 3B, the 13 booster Raptors fired back up for a boost-back burn. At 3C, this is where it started to go off the rails. While the grid fins did appear to steer the booster back towards Boca Chica, although that has not been confirmed, they did not manage to do so in a controlled manner, and it's more obvious towards the end of that flight when the fins are trying frantically to get the ship back under control. 3C also claims methane venting would be used to rotate Super Heavy, but the tanks were pretty much dry. Partial marks on 3C, but 3D is where the first obvious failures occur. Of the 13 Raptors that were supposed to reignite, only 3 did, and 2 of those 3 did not manage to remain lit. As a result, 3E did not happen. The hover and soft landing that were supposed to be part of the mission parameters could not be executed. Also, it apparently blew up. Moving back up to the top, Step 4 calls for the ship to reach orbital velocity before the 6 Raptors shut down. The ship did not reach that speed of 28,800 kilometers per hour, falling over 2,300 kilometers per hour short of that target at an altitude of 150 kilometers. Step 5 was the Pez dispenser door demo. From the available footage in a live feed, the door did not appear to open fully, but that may have been a result of the angle from the camera monitoring it. We note that before the door was opened, the ship was not spinning, and after the payload bay vented is when the spinning began. Step 6 was the LOX transfer from the header to the main tank. If the test was conducted, it did not noticeably affect the level of LOX in the target tank, so we have no indication that the test took place. Step 7 was the attempt to close the payload bay door, which looked to suffer an additional error, as the last frames of the door show it to be more open than at any other point during the flight. So we're going to revise Step 5 as a failure, using Step 7 as proof the door did not operate as intended, and the failure to open at the 12-minute mark would confirm that. At Step 8, Starship Raptor relight was completely skipped over, despite the need to prove that ability for the success of future missions. Step number 9, the controlled descent of the craft did not happen. The Step 10, deceleration from orbital velocity didn't happen. And Step 11, intended soft belly flop landing did not happen to terminate the flight safely at a known point of the Indian Ocean. Given that the craft re-entered the atmosphere 3 minutes ahead of time in an uncontrolled manner, it's safe to say that Starship 28 did not land where they had intended it to. Now, when you compare this mission arc to their definition of a successful mission, which would be all green check marks, would you say that Starship looks like a vehicle capable of the missions before it? We would say not. And that's why claims and projections made during this broadcast are completely misleading and out of place. Here's a couple of examples.
Starship will allow us to fly the heaviest payloads ever flown, land humans on the moon again after more than a half century, and ultimately fly humans further into space than ever before, even to Mars.
Everything in this statement is aspirational. The 100-ton payload ability of the current design has not been proven or even attempted, as this test article was completely empty. Yet the payload claim is made again at T-minus 1705 in a different context.
Now, with those future improvements, that'll allow Starship to carry somewhere between 150 and 250 metric tons to orbit, depending on the configuration. And that matters because the amount of mass we're able to launch per rocket is critical to creating a self-sustaining city on Mars.
So we're back to pumping the self-sustaining city on Mars, are we? Meanwhile, the original Artemis contract had the first lunar landing scheduled for 2 months ago in January of 2024. And Musk's promise of 4 ships to Mars this year, well, let's be honest, that was never happening. SpaceX has no contract with NASA to fly to Mars for any purpose, which means SpaceX would have to entirely fund that mission themselves. And their finances are already sketchy, burning $2 billion a year on this Boca Chica operation alone, including the lion's share of the HLS money that they were set to receive. Ignoring Mars for the time being, humans are not traveling to the moon on Starship either. They are to be shuttled between Earth and the moon for the Artemis paradigm by the human-rated Orion capsule, not Starship. Starship, in a best-case scenario, will only be used as an elevator between lunar orbit and the lunar surface.
But the most important thing about Starship is that it's designed to be a fully, rapidly reusable, reliable rocket, or what we like to call the 4 Rs.
Despite this claim being made ad nauseum throughout the launch, to date, SpaceX have not only not recovered any of their hardware, they could not have possibly recovered any from this launch, even if they had planned an attempt, which they did not. If SpaceX wants to continue pumping this system as a rapidly reusable, reliable rocket, they had best start proving that in the very near future.
When Starship takes astronauts to the lunar surface as part of NASA's Artemis program, it will be refilled in space by a Starship tanker spacecraft before boosting itself into a lunar orbit, like you see here. Transferring a large amount of cryogenic liquid in space has never been done by anyone, ever. The ability to refill Starships once in orbit will be critical for landing on the moon and is a key technology for enabling deep space exploration and ultimately flights to Mars.
Everything about that statement is misleading, and so is the video being used behind it. That animation does not represent the test being conducted during IFT3, and the description of Starship docking with a red singular Starship tanker before boosting itself into a lunar orbit ignores the fact that over 20 such matings will be required to fill the tank for that journey. What Kate is telling the audience here was very reminiscent of what Musk showed the Starship audience in 2019 on the giant video screens, where full tanks on one Starship tanker are transferred to the empty tanks on the manned craft on the right, completely filling the recipient. However, all the propellant in that tanker graphic would have been burned off, as it was during this launch, simply to reach orbit.
And in between the first and second stages is our hot stage, which is critical for our newest separation technique. Ultimately, hot staging could increase Starship's payload to orbit capacity by 10%, which directly translates to more payload and more people to the moon and Mars.
Another misleading claim, as Starship is not now, nor is it likely to become, human-rated, owing to the lack of a launch abort system. And as we've seen, when these vehicles fail, there is very little time to react accordingly to save any lives that may be aboard. When Kate insinuates that this technique will allow more people, specifically, to travel to the moon, it is deceiving the audience completely, because the people heading to the moon are going to make the journey in the Orion capsule. And that's regardless of whether the HLS system is being provided by SpaceX or Blue Origin. Kate repeats this nonsense a couple of times.
The team at Starbase has been hard at work developing and manufacturing the hardware that will ultimately take humans back and forth to the moon and Mars.
Then, of course, you have Musk, after this third Starship failure in a year, telling his legion of 178 million Twitter followers this monster machine will be on Mars by 2030. And his comments section were eating it up. This was after Musk said that he hopes to get Starship to the moon by 2029 in a very similar tweet from February 9th of 2024. Well, if Musk expects to get Starship to Mars by 2030, he'll have to hit the home and transfer window that runs from the end of 2028 into January of 2029, because the next one is 2031. Okay, listen. Mars was mentioned 12 times during the course of this broadcast.
The gateway to Mars. Mars. Mars.
Mars, 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 Mars,
Mars.
Mars, Mars.
In the context of transporting people there for the purposes of colonization to create a self-sustaining city, which, ironically, would require millions of pounds of supplies to be sent from Earth.
When the time comes to make the leap to Mars, everything ramps up by orders of magnitude. The logistics of supporting an entire city on Mars are daunting and will require millions of pounds of cargo flown from Earth and spread out over thousands of launches.
And today's flight test is one more step toward that ultimate goal.
It's the same tripe that his fans have been gobbling up since 2016, and it's no more believable to intelligent people now than it was then. No different than the recent claim that Musk was going to create gravity on Starship by merely spinning it. This is scientific illiteracy at its finest, consumed en masse by people even more scientifically illiterate than Musk. Even the article author knows better, and adds this disclaimer towards the end of the page. And given Musk's strong tendency to mislead and make largely meaningless predictions, his comments should be taken with the usual grain of salt. Indeed. Again, if we go to the Artemis roadmap, Starship is not going back and forth between Earth and the Moon. So regardless of what it can carry to orbit, it will only be able to do it the single time.
Now, SpaceX will perform one uncrewed demonstration flight before NASA's Artemis 3 mission. After those first expeditions, we'll be ready to fly more people along with everything it takes to build a moon base. There's so much to look forward to. It's incredible that humans are finally going back to the moon.
That unmanned demo mission that she's talking about, even if it goes according to plan, is not going to prove much at all. The vehicle they're planning on sending has been dummied down, the same way the declared propellant transfer was, down to a stripped out version of the craft that will not even be required to lift back off from the lunar surface. Building a moon base, as Kate claims, would require a fleet of non-reusable starships landing on the moon, each of them requiring 20 or more tankers per vehicle to make that journey. The paradigm is simply ridiculous. When it comes right down to it, SpaceX needs to put a sock in all these claims and just buckle down to deliver what they've been paid to deliver, which is a lunar lander by 2026. Not a satellite deployment craft, not a Mars colonization cargo hauler, not even a moon base builder. A space elevator between lunar orbit and the moon. That's what they were paid $3 billion to create. So SpaceX, get this system up and running, if you can. Then see what it might be capable of. It might not keep the hype train going for your venture capitalists and your next funding round, but it's what you need to do right now. And if you can't do it because you're too distracted with all this other bullshit, then give NASA their money back and make way for other companies like Dynetics, who had a great concept for a dedicated lander, and they had a strong focus on the job at hand. Further, and this is on all fronts, quit spinning failures to make them appear successful.
For Flight 1, we wanted to clear the pad, and we did. For Flight 2, we wanted to get through hot staging separation, and we did.
Learn to call a spade a spade. If it failed, call it a failure. Start being honest and transparent, and quit lying after every event to the people who still believe in you. To hammer this point home, just as we're wrapping up this production, Musk must have gone on another trip to K-Town when he announced that Starship will become an interstellar craft. Ignoring the limitations of the ship, the frailty of the human body, the average human lifespan, and the sheer stupidity of the claim, let's lay down some facts here about interstellar travel. The closest star to Earth is Proxima Centauri, only 4.246 light-years away, a number that appears reasonable until you convert it and discover that's 40,208 billion kilometers away, not exactly a day trip. So let's put our solar system at the center here as a single red pixel. It's there, you just have to squint. And do the same with Proxima Centauri, then run the math on that radius to form a sphere, which won't be to scale because even at 1 pixel, our solar system in that diagram would be thousands of times too large. At 4/3 pi r cubed, the spherical void our solar system sits at the center of has a volume of 272 followed by 39 zeros, making it 272 duodecillion cubic kilometers of nothingness before that boundary is contacted one single time by our closest neighbor. But Musk wants people to now believe his tinfoil rocket is going to allow humanity the ability to go to other stars. The Muskrats will tell you that the launch was a success. They'll also tell you that everything Musk does is genius, that this iterative testing process is paradigm shifting, first principle thinking, or whatever Rocket Jesus tells them to say. At this point, it has all become noise that we have to black out to face facts. Did IFT3 go further than the 2 launches before it? Yes. Was the launch a success? Obviously not, with 2 failed re-entries and failed experiments to boot. A good friend of the channel sent a clip from a video done in 2021, and we tracked down the full 30-minute cut of it, It's called Destination Mars, produced by Journeyman TV for the Australian Broadcast Corporation. It contains candid words about the program from Charlie Bolden, Obama's pick for NASA administrator who had the job from 2009 to 2017. Bolden is a former naval aviator and space shuttle astronaut for 14 years. Bolden, the 12th NASA administrator, left NASA in January of 2017, with Robert Lightfoot Jr. taking over duties until Mike Pence sworn in Jim Bridenstine in April of 2018 as administrator number 13. Here's what Charlie had to say about Musk, SpaceX, and Starship.
The difficulty for me as a huge fan of SpaceX, but a huge skeptic about Starship, is the fact that it's so big, it's so massive. They'll learn when they go to the moon. Landing on them, if Neil Armstrong were alive today to talk to them, he would probably say, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. If we lost rockets at the rate that Elon Musk loses his big Starship, NASA would have been out of business. Congress would have shut us down. If we lost one Starship, let alone 6 or however many it's been, we can't do that.
Now the obvious question to ask is, if NASA itself would have been immediately shut down by Congress for losing vehicle after vehicle, why is it now permissible for a NASA contractor to lose ship after ship with no apparent end in sight as they burn through taxpayers' money? So far across the 3 most recent launches, the Starship demonstration program has thrown 3 entire vehicle systems and 117 Raptor engines into the sea. In comparison, as our good friend of the channel Pedmets reminded us, Marcus House, and Tim Dodd, the highly successful shuttle program, which flew perfectly on its first attempt, used a total of 46 RS-25 engines across all 135 flights. And 4 of those same engines powered the first SLS launch in November of 2022, which also launched perfectly on its first attempt. With Starship, they've already wasted 3 times the number of engines from that entire program, and now they litter the bottom of the ocean, along with 3 destroyed Super Heavy boosters and 3 full-sized Starship test articles, all without getting a single Starship to orbit yet. The not-so-obvious question to ask then is, how much longer will Musk be allowed to continue operating this program this way, making all kinds of fantastical promises but not delivering on the contract before the adults in government start holding his feet to the fire, demanding results? Going back to the Twitter poll from the top of the episode, how do we call this one? Well, since Super Heavy Booster 10 didn't climb as high as Starship by half, we'll give it to the most popular answer as post-separation failure, making 40% of the respondents happy with their choice. With Starship 28, technically, it was lost during suborbital re-entry, so we'll put it here. But once the Raptors went dead on the way up, with the propellant tanks dry at T plus 830, then the Raptors refusing to fire up on command, there's an argument to be made that for the next 36 minutes, the bird was already flying dead, and just waiting to fall from the sky. So between the 2 responses, 76% of the respondents got it right. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Common Sense Skeptic. Not as much fireworks on film as we normally have, but the end result is the same. Both vehicles were lost, and had this been a real mission, it would have been considered a real disaster with real fatalities if humans had been aboard, as the commentators and Musk would like to have you believe is coming in the very near future. We'd like to send an extra, very special thank you along to our patrons on patreon.com, who have been extremely helpful with their direct support of this channel and with their questions and episode suggestions. If you would also like to support us directly, visit us at patreon.com/thecommonsense-skeptic. The other best way you can help support our efforts is by giving this episode a thumbs up, sharing it with your friends, and making sure you're subscribed so that you'll know when the Common Sense Skeptic returns.